The Golan Heights is your territory. Donald Trump says the US recognizes Israel's sovereignty over the occupied Syrian land. It's a boost for Benjamin Netanyahu's election campaign, but condemned by world leaders. Is Trump helping or hindering peace in the Middle East? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Nick Clark. So, US President Donald Trump has done it again. In his latest controversial move, he has recognized Israeli sovereignty over the occupied Golan Heights, ending decades of US policy towards the region. Embattled Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was present when Trump signed the order. Israel captured the territory in 1967 and annexed it in 1981 in a move not recognized internationally. Syria says Trump's decision is a blatant attack on its sovereignty. The United Nations says the status of the Golan Heights remains unchanged. Well, Trump seems unmoved by the criticism.
Today, I am taking historic action to promote Israel's ability to defend itself and really to have a very powerful, very strong national security, which they're entitled to have. In a moment, I will sign a presidential proclamation recognizing Israel's sovereign right over the Golan Heights. The state of Israel took control of the Golan Heights in 1967 to safeguard its security from external threats.
Well, as you can imagine, the proclamation was welcomed by the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, who's fighting an election in less than 2 weeks.
Your decision to recognize Israel's sovereignty on the Golan Heights is so historic. Your recognition is a twofold act of historic justice. Israel won the Golan Heights in a just war of self-defense, and the Jewish people's roots in the Golan go back thousands of years.
So why is the occupied Golan Heights of such strategic importance to Israel? Well, the mountainous region provides the country with an excellent vantage point for monitoring movements in Syria and provides a natural buffer against any military aggression. The area is also a major source of water. Rainwater from the Golan's catchment feeds into the Jordan River, providing a third of Israel's needs. The land is fertile and the volcanic soil is perfect for vineyards, orchards, and grazing for livestock. All right, let's introduce our panel. In Beirut, we have Rami, who's a senior fellow at the Issam Institute for Public Policy at the American University of Beirut. In Geneva, we have Guillaume Charron, Geneva director and Middle East analyst at Independent Diplomat, which is a non-profit advisory group that advises governments and democratic groups across the world. And in Washington, D.C., I'm glad to say we're joined by Eugene Kontorovich. He's a director of international law at the Kohelet Policy Forum in Jerusalem. Also advised both the Israeli and the American governments on the occupied Golan Heights. Welcome to you all, gentlemen. Rami, Khouri, I'd like to start with you. Donald Trump said it would happen. It has. What's your take?
It's a dangerous move, but in keeping with Trump's policy, the Trump-Kushner approach, actually Trump-Kushner-Shadon-Edelson approach, has been very much to do whatever the right wing in Israel wants, the Netanyahu government with the right, the Jerusalem embassy move of the United States, recognizing all Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and now the Golan move, cutting assistance to Palestinians through UNRWA and other means. This is very much part of a Trumpian policy, which is rejected by virtually the whole world. There's one or two small states here and there that go along with it. The danger is not only the impact on the Middle East, which will be more rhetorical than actual in the short run, probably, but the danger is that it sets a new pattern by which the United States tells the world that whatever the United States wants will happen across the world, or you'll be sanctioned, or you'll be, your money will be withdrawn, or something will happen to you. And it says that whatever Israel wants, in the Levant at least, in the Arab-Israeli arena, will prevail over any international law or the equal rights of other people. So there's a double threat in the Trump move on the Golan Heights, and there's possibly more to come if Israel tries to annex the West Bank. The Arabs are not in a position to do anything right now militarily or in any other way against this, and the danger is that the foundations of international law and basic ethics globally will crumble simply because Donald Trump and Jared Kushner and their supporters and the right-wing evangelical and pro-Zionist movements in the U.S. want this to happen.
All right, we'll get into all of that in the next 20 minutes or so. But first, Guillaume Charron, the thing is, it doesn't actually change anything on the ground. The status quo is completely maintained, isn't it?
On the surface of it, I would say yes. I mean, tomorrow the children in the Golan Heights are going to wake up, go to school. Nothing seems to have changed. In fact, for the Israeli public as well, things will probably feel even, more comfortable than they were before. There is a sort of a consensus in Israel that the Golan belongs to them, and so this will be business as usual. But in reality, this is not really business as usual. The Geneva Conventions and the Hague Conventions on occupation, the UN Charter and all of that were crafted not by radical extremists, leftists or militants, but by military personnel, by diplomats, seasoned diplomats, who at the end of the First and Second World War realized that it was better to actually have international law and have legal frameworks to actually settle disputes between the countries, especially insofar as occupation is concerned. And by discarding and not availing themselves of all of this experience, what has happened is that you are effectively taking the possibility of those negotiations under these frameworks outside. And so you're only left with violent means to resolve disputes between, say, Syria, in this case, and its potential allies, and Israel.
Okay, let's throw
itself.
that to Washington, D.C. and Eugene Kontorovich. Eugene contravenes international law, sets a bad precedent and opens the door for other nations to take territory. What do you say to that?
Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights and the U.S. recognition of it is entirely consistent with international law. And indeed, this long-delayed recognition actually is going to contribute to security and deter aggression. International law bans the use of force in aggressive wars, wars where one country is attacking another. On the other hand, it says that self-defense is an inherent right of countries. So not all uses of force are illegal. International law might say that if you conduct a war of aggression, you cannot benefit from it by taking territory. But when the underlying war is legal, when it's defensive, when it's not condemned by the United Nations, then it is not impossible to take territory in such a war. And that's the difference between the Golan and Crimea. When Russia took Crimea, it was in a clear war of aggression, and the United Nations condemned it as such. In 1967, the United Nations, which is no friend of Israel, did not condemn Israel's use of force because it was a clear defensive war. Israel defended itself from an effort by Syria and Egypt to destroy it in 1967, and there have been 52 years of Syrian attempts to destroy Israel ever since. So I don't think a rule that says if you take a small amount of territory when you are defending from an attack, continue to be attacked by that same enemy for 52 years, then that might be recognized as part of your territory. That's not going to set any kind of destabilizing precedent. Indeed, if you have the contrary rule, that no matter how many times a country attacks you, it can never lose territory, that is an invitation to aggression. Let me put that
to Rami Khouri in Beirut. Rami, so this move is entirely consistent with international law. What do you say to that?
Well, that's what Netanyahu and the extreme right wing in Israel say. This is political gobbledygook masquerading as legal niceties. The fact is you cannot acquire territory. You can use force to defend yourself, absolutely, and people do it all the time. You cannot acquire territory by force. That's what the United Nations resolutions and all the other international standards say. So this defensive argument that Israel should keep the Golan because it obtained it in a defensive war is rejected by the entire world. I mean, if this was a rational argument, it would have been accepted years and years ago. It's not a rational argument. It's a political ploy which the Israeli right wing is using. And it has the man in the White House now who will go along with this, based partly on his ignorance of the facts and based partly on his reliance on very pro-Israeli political groups and donors and evangelical groups and people of that sort. So this is not a serious argument, and the world really should just ignore it and get on with the business of generating a peace agreement that brings peace to both sides, lets them retain their original territory, and guaranteed security for everybody in the region. That's the route to peace.
Right, Eugene, it's certainly true, isn't it, that there's very little international support for this?
Quite to the contrary. I challenge Rami to find, there's a difference between political support and legal precedent, and I challenge Rami to identify a single precedent in which it has been said that a country is not allowed to acquire territory through defensive war. As I demonstrate in my academic writing, it's quite clear that even the UN in 1967 said it was unclear whether there is any rule against the acquisition of territory in a defensive war. Only after Israel acquired the territory did people start reconsidering whether that's a good rule. But in 1967, it is quite clear there's no such rule. There was no precedent. And I would challenge anyone to identify a contrary precedent. Now, international law is not a popularity contest. We don't do a survey to find out what the rules are. We look for precedents and we look for binding rules. There are no binding contrary precedents whatsoever.
All right, listen, gentlemen, I think this is something we're just going to have to, at this point, agree to disagree on, because we could go on all night about this. And I suspect it won't be the first thing that we're going to disagree on, or the panel is going to disagree on. But Guillaume, if I can come to you, you did allude to this, as to where this could all end. Maybe the West Bank is next.
I mean, I definitely think that there'll be repercussions. I don't think we agree to disagree, and I'd like to point that out. Israel and that conflict in general has great emotional charge, and Israel is always looking for very strong judicial arguments to defend its position. On the West Bank, it's used the very minute detail of the absence of a sovereign, so that they've occupied the territory, but then since there wasn't a sovereign, and now this issue of defense. However, what makes international law international is the fact that it's not just Israel, it's an international consensus on both these issues, whether it's all the states, really all the states, with the exception of Israel and now just one, the US, which doesn't make it right, agree that Israel has occupied the Golan Heights. And the same thing goes for the 1967 occupation of the West Bank. Now, the next move is definitely that Israel is most likely going to actually recommend the annexation of Area C, which is a part of the West Bank, actually the majority of it, where settlers are moving and living, and where Israel is already applying its own national law in violation to IHL. There are other stakeholders that determine what international law says and does, and that's the ICRC and other international mechanisms related to that, including here the Human Rights Councils and the treaty bodies, who all unilaterally, and this is public because you can check it on their site, also declare both of these territories to be occupied. I think that for Israel, the main issue, what I like is the settlers, who tend to actually be very honest about that, because they don't resort to international law argument. They resort to the policy of the deeds. Israel was founded on a policy of the deeds, and that's the argument that they always say, that since Israel was founded like this, why can't it continue on acquiring the rest of the territories that way?
Eugene, let me put this to you, this issue about the West Bank. Is this what you would anticipate, that the West Bank is next?
Well, we know that President Trump is going to put forward a peace plan. And again, I think it's important to remind the viewers that these territories Israel has offered up for peace multiple times in the past 52 years. There have been multiple credible offers where Israel, along with the United States, has said, we will give this up in exchange for peace. And the Palestinians, the other Arab actors, did not accept. There's going to be another attempt to do that. But I think it's important to know that time cannot stand still forever. An area cannot be frozen in limbo by a rejection by the aggressor side to make peace. And I think it's quite clear that if the Palestinians do not accept a very generous offer, again, for the 5th time, no other people seeking national independence, has ever rejected an internationally backed offer of statehood within even part of their borders. Imagine if the Kurds were offered a state in part of their borders. They would for sure say yes. The Palestinians have said no over and over again. And I think one message President Trump is sending them is, at some point, you have to either say yes or your no becomes some kind of acceptance of the status quo.
Do you think, Rami, that President Trump is actually has done this in a tactical sense, that he's looking ahead to the peace process, to the so-called deal of the century, that this is going to come into play there in some shape or form?
I think President Trump is looking short-term at his election prospects coming up after he lost the House of Representatives in the midterm election. He's looking at his political donors. He's looking at the evangelical right. He's looking at Sheldon Adelson and the money people who give him support from different groups in the United States, different lobbies, different supporters. He's looking at the Netanyahu election coming up. He's looking at what his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is telling him, and Jared Kushner doesn't really know very much about this region, has been a friend of Netanyahu's since teenage days or something like that. So he's looking at forces and interests around him that are almost totally pro-Israeli and the right wing of the Israeli Zionist spectrum. So I don't think we should think that Trump has any kind of long-term strategy in place. But what this is consistent with is a Trumpian tendency to basically lay down the law not just for Jerusalem and the Golan and the West Bank and Israel and Palestine, but to basically lay down the law for the whole world. Now that Trump is saying he doesn't want Germany to import gas from Russia, and if it does, it's going to be sanctioned. He's sanctioning countries that do business with Iran. So this is the real bigger danger in this move. It's not the narrow issue of just the Golan and the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's the bigger issue that we have a kind of runaway train wreck in the United States White House that's essentially telling the world the U.S. is going to lay down the law for the entire world, and if you don't go along with us, we're going to sanction you, we're going to do something terrible to you, we're going to withdraw money, and that's the real danger.
Okay, Guillaume, just bringing it back to the peace process. What's your sense that this proclamation, if you like, has done to the peace process? Where are we with this so-called deal of the century?
I mean, Jared's plan and that deal is, in essence, an Israeli-American deal. I haven't heard the Palestinians, parties or Palestinian Authority respond positively to any of these deals. We haven't heard the Arabs come forward, countries and so on, towards those deals. It's a no deal so far. I don't think it's going to go very far. What Rami says is right in the sense, however, that with might they can push for some of these policies. Naftali Bennett, for instance, in Israel, is talking to the settlers, and he's a settler leader himself, obviously, and they're talking with some of the Palestinians in the West Bank, trying to actually find little deals there, and so on and so forth, to ascertain their forces there. But at the end of the day, all this demonstrates to the extremists, so the elements that are radicalizing themselves in the Arab world, that basically in the Arab, the Arab psyche, their leaders and all the others are not actually having the might and the capacity to stand up to Israel, and that fuels all that extremism. And so I think that on the long term, it's not actually leading to a just and sustainable solution, including for the Israelis.
And Eugene, on that front, a just and sustainable solution and also a peaceful solution. In response to this, as you'll know, Syria has vowed to recover the area through all available means. Russia has warned the decree could drive a new wave of tensions in the Middle East region. Turkey has said it's impossible to accept the United States decree. How is this good for peace in the region?
Well, first of all, Syrian protests and Syrian threats of violence should be taken with a grain of salt, because Syria has, for the past 52 years, constantly been attacking Israel. Iran, Syria's real power and controller, has been trying to open up a northern front against Israel for decades. So it's not that just Syria all of a sudden is upset with Israel. The Syrian threat has been there from the beginning. Israel is now better positioned to protect itself from the Syrian threat. And I think it's very good for peace because previously the view was if countries attack Israel and gain some territory, no one will ever force them to leave because they don't care about international law. It's very hard to pressure them. We saw that Syria and Iran act with total disregard for international law. If, on the other hand, they miscalculate and Israel gains an advantage, Israel will have to return what it won. So it seems attacking Israel would be a no-brainer strategy. You win if you win, and you don't lose if you lose. This creates a new formula. If you lose, you actually will lose. And that is going to discourage aggression. That's going to show that aggression has a price.
If you lose, you actually will lose. This is good for peace. Rami Khouri, what do you say to that?
This is the Trumpian Netanyahu Zionist right-wing view that they have force, they can use it, they can dominate the region as they want. They're going to pummel their enemies or their foes into submission as they're trying to do with the Palestinians, but it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And the best example of this is the Jewish people themselves, who thousands of years later insisted on having their state and achieved it. The people don't go away when you treat them like animals. They resist, they fight back, and they keep working in any way they can. The Arabs have clearly put on the table a peace plan that says we will exist peacefully with Israel with normal relations, secure borders, and all that. So the Israelis and the Arabs have an opportunity to negotiate a comprehensive and just peace that's just to both sides. The Arabs are not in any situation where they're going to attack Israel. Anybody who attacks Israel with its nuclear weapons and American support has got to be nuts. So nobody's going to attack Israel. This is very traditional pro-right-wing Zionist Israeli propaganda, and we're hearing it all the time.
A rocket just destroyed a house in Israel yesterday.
The answer to the conflict is a peace agreement.
Eugene
Yes,
just mentioned the strike in Israel yesterday, Rami.
Yes, he did. It injured 7 people in Israel. Israel has injured 31,000 Palestinians in the last year and killed over 200. 31,000 Palestinians have been injured, mostly along the Gaza border. So there's a war going on. People are going to keep attacking each other. We want to stop that war. We don't want to create conditions on the ground of permanent occupation and the kind of attacks that Israel does.
That's after
in
Israel
Gaza
left
Beirut
Gaza
years ago that kills thousands and thousands of people.
Okay, guys, we're running out of time.
Well,
We've got about a minute and a half left.
left Gaza
Eugene,
because
sorry, Guillaume, I just want to put to you that Trump has moved unilaterally in the Middle East on several occasions, flying in the face of international opinion. Perhaps this is a smart move after years of zero progress in the region, just to shake things up and see if we can get some reaction towards peace.
I mean, he is shaking things up. It doesn't mean that it's going to pay off the way he wants. I mean, George Bush shook things up when he invaded Iraq. At the time, the U.S. standing in the region was relatively good. At the end today, the U.S. standing in the region actually is quite weak. And the Iranians are now actually in a stronger position than they were back then. I foresee something very similar happening here, whereby we have very short-term solutions being pushed down the throat of everyone in the region to the benefit to the right-wing Israelis, not even the whole benefit of the situation. What happens when they annexed Area C and start having questions about, can you be a Jewish state or a democracy? There's plenty of questions, and let us not forget that the issue here of the Golan Heights is not so much security in military terms the way that it is portrayed, because with the new drones and the revolutionary in military affairs with satellites and imagery and the possibility of negotiating a no man's land and so on and so forth, it's not really about that. It's about access to water, and water is drying up fast in the region. We work on climate change at ID, and I can tell you that in the region, water is going to disappear quite rapidly. The Golan Heights is one of the very few sources there. It provides 30% of Israel's water, 70% of its potable water. This is why Israel wants the Golan Heights more than anything. In fact,
well, water is
Sagi, when
water is just one of the issues. Gentlemen, we have run out of time. I'm sorry, we're going to have to jump in there. But do appreciate your perspectives on this. Thank you to all our guests, to Rami Khouri, to Guillaume Charron and Eugene Kontorovich. Thank you too for watching. You can see this program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nick Clark, and the whole team here, it is goodbye for now.